Hello, welcome to Film Trace. This is a podcast where we trace the life of a film from conception to production, all the way to release and reception. We are doing, what are we doing? Creepshow today as part of our self-aware horror series, cycle, volume, chapter, whatever you want to call it. This is a movie that I have never seen before, even though I love George Romero. At least I say I love George Romero, but I've never seen this. Written by Stephen King. I think I selected it because I'd never seen it before. Is one of the reasons why I wanted to dive into this.
I was curious, yeah.
And then on top of that, we're going to do a little chaser film, which is, you definitely got to stay tuned for that. Me talking about House is going to be very entertaining. Yes. I'll tell you that. Chris, we have a special guest today too. Who do we got?
Yeah, we are happy to bring on Max from Galaxy of Film, which is an awesome podcast. You can find all the usual places, but I want you to talk about it. Welcome, Max. Tell us who you are and what your show is all about.
Hey, thanks for having me on, guys. I'm Max from Galaxy of Film. I'm the host over there and the founder of everything we got going on. Like you mentioned, we are a podcast. We do weekly film discussions as well, and those kind of range between new releases, older stuff, some cult classic film, just kind of whatever picks our interest for that week. And we usually have a pairing film to go with it, whether it be the same director, same actor, same year of release, just something to kind of tie the two together. And we also have stuff going on our YouTube channel, Galaxy of Film Productions. We have some short films in the works over there, and we just finished releasing the finale of our New York series, our vlog series recently. So very cool. That's pretty fun as well.
What is your? I saw you guys did an episode on Batman. Give me your
the Batman.
I'm sorry, the Batman. My apologies. Give me your quick thoughts. I would love.
Oh man, I just saw it again yesterday for the second time. Absolutely loved it. Without giving away spoilers, this is definitely the detective side of Batman I've been wanting to see for a very long time.
It's kind of noir-y, isn't it? A little bit of noir going on there.
Yeah, definitely, man.
Yeah, it's. Chris, have you seen it yet?
No. I don't know when I'm gonna have 3 spare hours. So.
It's all 3 hours, dude. There's no joke.
Doesn't feel like it, in my opinion. Man, I love it.
Really?
It does go pretty quick. Yeah, it does go pretty quick, but it is a long movie. All right, let's jump into this. Let's start talking about Creepshow. Chris, do you have something to say?
I mean, always, but yes.
What do you got?
I mean, I'm curious why you've never seen this. And Max, this is a first time watch for you as well, right? So
yeah, this is.
Can you guys start with that? Like, why did it take you so long?
I'll go ahead quickly here. It scared me, the poster. Like, even as a little kid, like the whole Crypt Keeper stuff. I watched Tales from the Crypt when I was growing up. Like, that scared me a little bit. But there was something about this that's always, and I am a horror nerd, I would say, but like I have a very specific type of horror movie that I love, and this is not one of them. Anything that is like focused on gore or gross out stuff, it's generally not my thing. So I honestly didn't even know George Romero directed this until like 2 or 3 months ago. And granted, it's not exactly his normal type of film. But yeah, that's kind of why it definitely kind of made me disgusted and uncomfortable, just the concept of it. That's why I kind of avoided it. Max, what about you, man?
Growing up, my parents just didn't have a lot of horror films playing around the house for whatever reason. Like I didn't get into horror until I was in middle or high school, actually. Yeah. So as a teenager now, in my early 20s, I'm making up for these movies I missed over the years that I've heard so much about. So this is just one that's been on my backlog for 5+ years. I'm just haven't had a chance to see until now.
Nice. I mean, it totally makes sense. I think because I was pretty much not parented, that's probably why I was brought into it so early. But I guess I'm specifically surprised with you, Dan, because the reason I got introduced to it at a young age, only in bits and pieces, was because it was a regular pick on TNT's Monster Vision with Joe Bob Briggs.
Okay. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. So like but I totally get it, because I also stayed up way too late watching Tales from the Crypt, and I still have like one particular episode that feel like I saw specifically way too young, and
Yeah.
and it kind of left a bad mark on me.
Yeah.
But I think Creepshow might have been the earliest example for me where I was like, oh, like horror and comedy are intrinsically linked. That was
interesting.
yeah.
Starting there.
And
Okay, starting with that.
but I think it might have been from that early age, because I have that vivid image stuck in my head of Leslie Nielsen burying Ted Danson in the sand. And, at age 10 or whatever, like that was the Naked Gun guy and the Cheers guy. So like, even though it was a
Imagine being
super
40 and
macabre
seeing
thing.
that for the first time, dude. It shook me a little bit. You know what's crazy about that though is you say that like, there's one that like stuck with you like that.
Yeah.
I didn't realize this, but I was randomly watching YouTube videos just in preparation for this, and I came across Creepshow 2. And there was a single frame scene, and I was like, oh no, that's it. And I watched it, and I was like, oh my God, I saw this when I was like 7 years old.
Oh, wow.
And it has literally haunted me since then. Like this image will pop up every once in my head, like as an adult. And it's sort of like had no idea what it was. It's the blob in the water.
Yes.
And the girl gets like eaten by the blob. And for some reason that was like burnt into my memory. So there's something about these films that does, I think, stay with you, especially when you see them young. Is it meant for young people? Think about like 1982. You got George Romero. It's basically it's a horror anthology.
Yeah.
It's set up like, I guess, like little comic book strip type things. I mean, the visual style obviously is an homage to the EC comics, but you talk about the horror comedy part of it. Is this targeted at kids, do you think?
I mean, it's interesting you say that, because my gut reaction is no, but I mean, the frame story is a kid reading horror comics. What's your take on that, Max?
Yeah, I agree. It is for kids, in my opinion. I think this is one of the perfect introductions to horrors as a kid. And like, even though I didn't grow up with Creepshow, I'll say I did grow up very heavily with something that was inspired by Creepshow, was Goosebumps, which was took that format and broke it into TV, of course. You know, obviously, I had the books and whatnot too. But I mean, that's how I discovered Creepshow initially, was because of that inspiration from Goosebumps.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, that also reminds me of a show that Dan and I grew up with, Are You Afraid of the Dark on Nickelodeon.
100%, yeah.
So I mean, the way that you talk about, like, just is it inherently like the structure of it, like even take away the frame story and the comic book element? Is it just because it's got that kind of like inviting playfulness factor to it? Because it is still written by Stephen King, and even though a lot of his books attracted young readers, myself included, like us kids that read Stephen King knew that we were reading something that was for grown-ups.
Yeah. I would say it's because of that. Like I say, it's inviting in a sense. Like if you look at this compared to, oh gosh, what's a better comparison?
Just throw it out there, whatever it is.
Well, the thing that comes to my mind right away is the horror anthology series VHS, which is just like, there's nothing child friendly about that, right?
Yeah, you're right with that, man. I've only seen bits of that too. Jeez.
Gosh. Well, I think the inherent, like, comic books are for kids, right?
Yeah.
But I mean, let's be honest. Like, this is an homage to comics that were made in the 50s by guys who were growing up in the 50s. So the distance there is pretty far. So there's, it's basically Stephen King and George Romero remembering their experiences with EC Comics back in the day before they were banned, essentially. So I don't know. There's definitely sort of, we assume comic books are for children, but is that assumption no longer true now that comic books have become like the lingua franca of like reality of like all entertainment? It's all comic book stuff. I mean, I don't know. Like, let's start there. Are comic books for children? I'm going to throw that out there.
Gosh, you're just getting.
I know, dude. Let's get deep on this one. Let's go deep.
I mean, I grew up with them, but I think there's been something strange in the past 20 years, maybe 15, with MCU that has like weirdly made it this kind of what's the word, like omnipotent kind of monolithic thing that maybe it's Disney, maybe it's whatever, that has just made it the assumption amongst the masses, at least in America, maybe elsewhere too, that comic books are now a thing that is just for everybody. Like it's been so pushed into like the ether that like I don't know, but has it always been that way, or is it?
Oh no. Like Max, what do you think about this? Like, did you grow up with comic books? Were you a comic book guy growing up?
Yeah, I grew up with comics, of course. I had a little comic shop nearby and everything. I'd stop by every other week to pick up some stuff. But like even like my generation, like I'm 22 now.
Yeah.
Growing up until right around in high school when the MCU started blowing up, I agree. It was like I'd hear it constantly from teachers, adults, who it might be if they're older than me. If you were seen reading a comic, you were looked down on as immature almost.
Oh, that's what we grew up with.
Yeah,
like, I don't know, Chris, if I'm in the minority here, but like I remember comics being pretty. I don't know what's the term I'm looking for. They were not cool in the 80s, right? In the early 90s.
Right. Well, yeah. I mean, I think that the thing that makes me kind of agree with that right off the bat is because we had in our town growing up, Dan, this comic shop that was very much just like a hole in the wall.
Yeah.
And that's kind of like the stereotypical kind of thing that you still see in pop culture today, even though the reality is that now there's like this whole industry built on it, and there's like huge big box type stores full of comics and tabletop games and all that. But yeah, I feel like there was also like that whole backlash against like Dungeons and Dragons, and so you would always have that crossover. But it's strange because we grew up in the 90s, Dan, and yet you still had like Batman movies back then dominating the box office.
Yeah.
And yet and like I think like that wasn't just driven by like tweens going out to the multiplexes, right? That was like
that's true. Yeah.
A mass event, right?
Yeah, maybe comics were always sort of around in a popular sense. I mean, obviously they've taken on a different dimension in the last 20 years.
Right. But in the early 80s when Creepshow was out, like what do you got? The Richard Donner Superman movies, and that's about it, right?
Yeah. And it is, I think part of the appeal of Creepshow is that it's supposed to be, and I think the comics themselves are supposed to be really transgressive. Right. The whole point of EC Comics was show you gross stuff and awful stuff, and it got to the point where they basically shut down this entire part of the company because the Congress got involved. U.S. Congress.
Yeah.
It was basically like, hey, this is not good for kids. We can't be promoting this stuff. And the company's like, okay, we're done. And so it didn't last that long. And so yeah, I do kind of find it interesting. Like, do we think that it's clear that when they made this movie, they thought that these comics were transgressive when they were growing up? Now viewing this, does that take a little bit of the edge off of it? Or do you still feel like does it feel transgressive to you guys watching it?
I feel like there's this, it's because that's so much, it's so wrapped up in nostalgia for me. So I feel like you have a clear eye on that, seeing this for the first time in 2022. Because like I still watch like the head in the sand segment in particular, and that does feel like really subversive and like taboo, and just like overall just like really gives me the heebie-jeebies still. But is that wrapped up in my memories of it from being a kid? I don't know. What do you think, Max?
Gosh, man.
Does it feel to you, Max, like it's like you're watching something taboo or dirty?
Right, like when you're a kid watching Goosebumps, even if not Tales from the Crypt. Like, where does it fit in that spectrum?
I'm trying to like not really, honestly, man. And I have to say it's because of that comic book, presence within Creepshow.
Sure.
Because of how welcoming it feels. I like know like for us, comics are acceptable even as we're older compared to kids, but still there's a sense of comfort with that.
Yeah.
I view, when I see a comic book in a film, typically I'm comparing or filling that with a pleasant memory of these growing up, right?
Yeah.
Right.
So in my head, like, this is something. All right, this is what another kid's reading, this is welcoming for him. It's also it reminds me of a good feeling of doing this too as a kid.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I mean, you think about how the film was constructed, and they made it, explicitly. And this is where the self-aware horror stuff comes in. It's like he got Tom Savini and everybody involved in the special effects to make it feel like a comic book. So a lot of the horror is filtered through this kind of colorful and vibrant frame. That in a weird way, on the one level, like it is very welcoming, but then it kind of makes it a little bit increasingly creepy on some level. The like I'm thinking like the red light they constantly use.
Yeah.
Especially in the whatever the one with the university, and it's in the crate. It's so over the top. There's a whole irony involved to this film that to me is why it's funny and engaging. And the horror aspect of it's a very specific type of horror. It's like a moral horror.
Yeah.
Where the person who transgresses gets their, the revenge is had, essentially. And I wonder, it feels so different than horror movies today. Like, does that happen in horror movies today? Like, where someone does something bad and they get like punished for it?
Right. I mean, with the crate is an interesting example, because I felt like I really had a perhaps different reaction to that one watching it as an adult versus remembering it slightly from TNT as a kid, because that's the only segment, in my estimation anyways, tell me if I'm wrong, where it's like, you have this transgressive wife character, but like Adrienne Barbeau and then Hal Holbrook as the kind of metaphorically castrated husband. And so like there's that whole like misogyny thread running through it too. And so that like just especially the ending of that one, even more so than the Leslie Nielsen one, is just like it makes me feel sick to my stomach at the end of it. Even though it's like essentially just a throwback to like B horror movies with like the monster in the crate under the stairs, right?
But she's a terrible person.
Yeah. But like what yeah, I think you're right, because like you look at horror movies nowadays, and like we were talking about this with the new iteration of Scream, right, where it's just like you have characters that are essentially empty vessels that are just like avatars for, suspense and violence. But even in Creepshow, where it's, you think you'd have so much working against that because there's these little self-contained vignettes, but these characters have so much more going on with them than the average, like teenager walking up the stairs in a movie nowadays.
That's a good point. Yeah, the characters there's a lot of depth to them.
Right. Even when it's super silly.
Do you guys have a favorite segment here? Max, did you have one that you just loved?
Oh, out of the five for Creepshow, I really did enjoy I forget the name of it as well. The one with the creature under the stairs. Actually, that was my favorite of the bunch.
Yeah, and that was like the longest one, I think, right? It was like 40 minutes long.
It's like the centerpiece. Yeah.
Yeah. What did you like about it?
Oh, the coloring specifically.
Yeah.
The red lighting was great, especially, and also the prop design on the actual puppet. I'm assuming it's a puppet for whatever that creature is. Looks great as well. I'm a big fan of like some of the Jim Henson work done in other films.
Yeah.
So when it comes to puppeteering and creature effects, I always try to take notice of those.
Yeah, it's really beautifully done. I think I would probably agree with you. Like I do feel like the crate one to me had the most what's the term I'm looking for? The maybe most muddled moral message to it.
Yeah,
sort of like going back to what Chris was saying.
Yeah,
morally complicated. That's probably a better way of putting it. Yeah, I mean, I thought it was just there's something super engaging and intriguing. There's like a weird undercurrent to the whole thing that felt very macabre. My least favorite one was the bug one, of course. Chris, did you have a favorite? Did you something that like sticks out, right? Because you have like history with it, so
yeah. I am still partial to. I just looked up the name of it. Something to tide you over.
Okay.
The Leslie Nielsen Ted Danson segment, just because it's such a strange set piece of like, pull the extension cord and TV set out to the beach. and like the interplay, like Leslie Nielsen's legit terrifying. I think.
Yeah, I mean, he's classically trained actor. This is the same year that Police Squad was on NBC.
Right.
Yeah, so it's such a weird juxtaposition, isn't it?
Right. I obviously like them all because I'm kind of a fanboy for this movie, but I felt like there was this element to this like one man showness to they're creeping up on you, the bug one.
Yeah.
And I think just by, if nothing else, it's like super impressive how they were able to like construct this whole like futuristic, like it's now retro futuristic apartment. But
yes.
One of my favorite stories about them making this movie, yes, the puppet work, the special effects work is fantastic throughout, but like those are legit cockroaches. They like went and to like a cave with entomologists in Trinidad, and they like collected 20,000 cockroaches to film that segment. Like, can you imagine any, like only George Romero would be that brazen and insane to like book a trip to Trinidad.
I feel like Stephen King was egging him on because like I happened to find an interview with Stephen King, and this is Stephen King's first screenplay, we should note too. He was interviewed by David Letterman for this press tour, and he talks about that. He talks about how they would like these guys would get in like, I guess kind of like biohazard suits we see all the time now because of COVID, and like lay down in bat guano and sit there. He's explaining this to David Letterman on like national TV, and the cockroaches, and they're like a foot long cockroaches, some of them would start to like move around, and that's how they would capture them, because they have to like lay still on the cave floor. I mean, it's like this like insanity. Like that's just
you could not pay me enough, man.
No, absolutely not. Like, there's no way. I mean, that kind of goes to like, taking a step back and thinking about this movie from a bigger scale. I think the one thing that going into it, I was a little bit sort of reluctant to, I don't know, I wasn't excited about, was the anthology aspect of it. How do we think how do we think the frame story worked here? And how do we think does each segment play into that frame? Is there something linking all of these together? Or is it just sort of, a grab bag of different horror stories?
Oof. It does.
Tough questions tonight, folks.
Yeah. It does feel like a grab bag to me. And I think that's part of the appeal, is that that playfulness comes not only from like the characterization and the monster effects and all that, but just from this idea. And it's like that pulp comic quality to it, right? Where it's like those comics that King and Romero are inspired by literally were just like ramshackle, haphazardly put together by a team of people that are just like pushing them out to the public. So like they're not thinking about like what's the overarching thematic blah blah blah, right?
Yeah.
On the same token, like to come back to that wraparound story again of the kid and the dad. I mean, you mentioned this concept of transgressions, and take away the complicated aspects of the crate, even though that's arguably once again the centerpiece of the whole thing. You have this really intensive and you can imagine from my point of view as a kid watching this, are like basically an argument from these like adult filmmakers that like of this kid that justifiably wants to kill his drunken father. I don't know. It's
what do we make of the frame story? To me it was just going back to the idea of the comics is sort of being a safe place for all these ideas that your parents won't tell you about.
Right.
I mean, to me, it reminds me about growing up of Mad Magazine. That was my sort of window to the world. And it was all these kind of crazy, kooky political ideas and stuff like that my parents would never talk about. But you're reading it as a 12-year-old and you kind of feel like, it's kind of a wink, wink. I'm in the know now about what's going on in the world. Not really, of course. But yeah, I mean, that frame story, it does feel very old fashioned and very 80s to me. Like this whole rebellion against like the Leave It to Beaver Americana thing. Like it feels like his father's so uptight. He yells, he drinks. He's like a caricature of a father from 1955 or something.
Yeah.
He's the stereotype like asshole dad. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, right. And so to me, it's sort of seeing it now. It's like, oh, okay, this is it seems very blunt. And very over the top. I don't know, Max, what did you feel about that, the frame story?
Maybe this is because I just didn't grow up with this movie.
Yeah.
So I don't have a nostalgia factor whatsoever for it, other than just the inspiration, like I said. The framework story, like I just didn't care too much about because of the father feeling very copy and paste as a stereotype.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, he doesn't. There's not a lot of nuance going on there.
No, it's pretty blunt. Yeah,
no, and it's. I mean, how about this? Like the comedic element here, because horror comedy is something that I have such troubles with. If I'm being honest.
You do, don't you? That's
I do have I have problems with it. I don't know, Chris. How do I even? What's funny about that? Explain to me the comedy of this.
Oh my gosh. I do remember watching this film maybe 6 or 7 years ago and really having a bad attitude about revisiting it.
Yeah.
And in particular, the segment that stars Stephen King as the farmer.
I don't know about that. Yeah.
Yeah. But I really, it really like it was a. But then once I got to the Leslie Nielsen segment, I was like, okay, I remember why I have like good memories of this movie. But then I rewatched it again this week. I splurged for the collector's edition Blu-ray get ready for the podcast. And there was something, I don't know, there was something really goofy in like the most endearing way possible of like Stephen King attempting to act under George Romero's direction. And this is the one segment that he did use an outline from a short story of his previously. The others are all original. But I don't know. There's something, and maybe it was because I was also reading a lot about the film to prepare for the cast, and it really feels like you get a lot of that enjoyment and let's just like straight up friendship between the two of them. We talked about this a little bit with Evil Dead 2 and the idea of Bruce Campbell as Sam Raimi's Ragdoll. Yeah. And it felt like Stephen King was like really just game in the 80s. And maybe it was because he was high a lot. But
he was on a lot of cocaine.
A lot of cocaine. But he did it did seem like he kind of like just gave himself over to this horror maestro and was like, do whatever you want with me. And there's like this great quote where King says that he asked Romero for some direction on how he should take this, absurd character. And Romero says to him, basically, act like Wile E. Coyote looks when he goes off a cliff and never change that. And so like there's this cartoonish element to it that just feels so, I don't know. It feels way more innocent than it actually is.
Yeah.
And I think that's where it kind of comes back to what we started the whole show with, which is like, this is kind of kid friendly. Like, I feel like I could take at least that segment out and show it to my kids and they'd be like, oh yeah, this is pretty funny. Or they would be like, what the fuck's wrong with you, Dad? Maybe both. Yeah.
Max, did you laugh a lot during this movie, you think? Did you find it like super comedic?
I'd say like the first half of it, I found was pretty entertaining. I wasn't, too big of a fan of the bug segment whatsoever. I wasn't too big of a fan either of the Beach of the TV segment, to be honest with you. Like the first three were really sold it for me of this one. But just the goofiness of this, man.
Yeah, honestly, it is quite over the top, isn't it?
Everyone acts like this is a comic book in a sense.
Yeah, it's very hammy. Yeah. It's very hammy.
Very hammy, very campy as well, Whole 9 yards.
I guess why I'm so like fascinated or focusing on this part of it is like the comedy element here is the source of the self-awareness, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right. It's why this movie is self-aware. It's because on the one hand, it's trying to harken back to this, period that no longer exists in terms of what this comic book series was all about back then. It's trying to go back in time mentally to a time when America felt maybe more, I don't know, settled or conservative. There's all this stuff built up in it, viewing it from the 80s back to the 50s. That I don't know, I find very fascinating because the comedy of it to me, like, I'm not trying to argue that it's not funny. There's tons of humor in this, especially the Stephen King part. But I think the type of humor that it is really reveals what type of film it is and what type of perspective that Romero and Stephen King had. It sounds like, I don't know, I didn't read too much on the conception of how this came to be, but it sounds like Stephen King and Romero sort of just like bonded over the love of this comic book. Is that right, Chris?
Yeah, essentially. There was also a weird, kind of funny story about Stephen King trying to get both Salem's Lot and The Stand adapted, but like those are two of his most like insanely long and convoluted stories, and they did end up both on one to the screen with as like a 3-hour adaptation and another one as a TV show. And so he had initially gotten hooked up with Romero about that. There was a vampire movie that came out through Warner Brothers called Martin, and basically some exec at Warner Brothers heard that like both of them were interested in meeting each other, and so they hooked him up, flew Romero out to Maine, and they basically came up with, they talked about their love of this comic book. And so they were like, oh, how about this? Their strategy at the time was, let's adapt Creepshow. Let's do this Creepshow concept. And then that, as long as it's successful, will help us make a legit adaptation of either Salem's Lot or The Stand.
Gotcha. Interesting.
But then, of course, neither of those panned out with Romero's involvement. Though I'd be so curious to see what Romero could have done with that. But of course, both Romero and King kind of were on a downward slope once the late 80s rolled around.
Well, it's interesting because this movie was pretty well received. Like it was shot for like what, I don't know, it's like $8 million, I think, and it ended up taking home over $21 million back in the day, which doesn't sound like a lot now, but inflation and stuff like that. So it was successful. We got a sequel in 1987. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't like it was like a flop or anything like that. I think it opened up to number 1. It's the only film that George Romero has opened to number 1 his entire career. And that's one of the things too I find this movie so interesting. It's so different than Romero's other work. Like it just doesn't feel, in watching videos and reactions to it, it's sort of like people talk a lot about the technical aspects of the film and how they think it's like, it's really well done, which I get. But like the thing that Romero always brought to me, it doesn't even matter if it's like Martin or Season of the Witch or the Dead films. There's always this pretty extreme political commentary.
True.
And with Creepshow, it's just not there. No. It's just not there at all.
Well, Carter's president while they're in production.
I don't know. Is there something there to like? I guess the point I'm trying to make is, thinking about the theme of self-aware horror and irony, and pointing to other works of art and trying to make art based on that art. How effective is this movie at the end of the day? If you're thinking about it in terms of, sure, is it entertaining? 100%. I don't think anybody would deny that, especially if you're into horror or gore or disgusting stuff. You're going to like this movie, and like even just like macabre stuff. But is there sort of a blunting aspect to this? Is like the edge of this shaved off a bit for some reason? For some reason, I think that it is, and I can't figure out why. It doesn't really land with a massive punch to me when I saw it. I was like, oh, this is good and it's interesting, but it felt very much of the early 80s is what it felt like to me. Yeah. I don't know if you felt that way, Chris. Like, am I talking gibberish now? Or
no. I mean, we touched on this a little bit with the Dead Alive episode, right? And I think that especially, from the early 80s to the early 90s, that's when a lot of this we were eventually leading to Scream 96, right? But it's kind of that awkward transition period where like these films, the horror genre, is starting to become more sentient, but it has to like really do this kind of, I don't know, it's the splatter subgenre, and like anthology throw stuff at the wall, Tales of the Crypt, and you have essentially this lost decade of basically nonsense. But and if it hits you at the right time, especially growing up, especially with like Joe Bob Briggs doing the intros for it, like then it works on a really just like visceral, like you were saying, Max, too, about like the coloring of the film and the creature design. Like if you have all the right elements, it's going to hit just on like a proficiency level. And to some degree, Dead Alive does that too. It maybe has that kind of like political commentary. Evil Dead does this too. It like even to like another degree with how batshit insane Sam Raimi wants to get with stop motion animation and all that. And so like ultimately, yeah, we're just like, I mean, we're in the pleasure zone, baby. That's
pleasure zone.
What else do you want?
Well, so this is a good turning point here to talk a little bit about House, because whereas this film I feel like has a resonance with horror fans, doesn't really hit outside of that group all that much, I wouldn't say. House, on the other hand, has become a huge cult film. And despite its being pretty nonsensical, I would argue, in a lot of ways, it has had a huge effect on a lot of different groups of people, especially artists. Well, first, let's start out with like thinking about House. Do we need a background, or should we just dive right into it? What do you think? I mean, does its reputation precede itself? Or
it kind of does, if you've heard of it. I mean, I feel like
the basics, Chris. What's the basics?
Oh my gosh, it's a haunted house movie. My sons are always asking about the movies that I'm watching for the podcast, and they specifically asked about this one because they heard the Japanese coming from the basement, and my son is in an after-school Japanese class. Well, my youngest.
Oh, cool, nice.
And so like he didn't recognize any words or anything, but he's like, "Were they speaking Japanese?" And then he asked what it's about, and then and I'm like trying to.
How do you even answer that?
No, I started mentioning the cat and the piano, and then I was just like, it's a haunted house. It's don't worry about it. Go to bed. But like that's essentially it. I mean, that's one of the things that I think makes a cult film is that it takes this a very simple idea and then distorts it, 100-fold.
Yeah.
And I mean, what else do you want to say? It's a group of friends, all teenage girls. They go to one of the girls' aunt's remote mansion before the aunt and supposedly her dad are going to arrive. And just chaos ensues. They find out that it's haunted, it's magical, and each of them kind of has their own superpower too, or stereotype, whatever you want to call it. Both. Supernatural events unfold. I'm curious what same question as with Creepshow. Maybe what's the holdup? I was all about seeing this movie when it was finally released in the US via Criterion in 2010.
I mean, Max, what's your history with this movie? Did you know about it beforehand?
I've known about this for a long time. The weird thing is, for whatever reason, back in like 2014 or 15, I discovered this movie the same way I discovered The Room. This got thrown into the same conversation somehow.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I could see that. I could totally see that. Yeah.
And so for the longest time, I'm expecting essentially Japanese Tommy Wiseau for whatever reason. The only thing I knew about this movie was there's a haunted house and it's called House. I purchased the physical Criterion copy about 2 years ago.
Sure.
It's sat on the shelf, just haven't had a chance to watch it. And I've been trying to get my co-host to want to cover this since we started Galaxy of Film, actually. So I was thrilled that you guys wanted to talk about it finally. I was like, finally excuse to watch this.
Yeah.
Popping in, and I was, certainly not greeted with the Japanese Tommy Wiseau.
I mean, what did you... I mean, for me, God, I don't think I knew that much about this film at all.
Okay.
I think you know what? I had seen T-shirts with it,
right?
Like the cover or whatever.
Mhm.
That's how I would sort of recognized it, and it's been popping up on HBO a lot because it's been on HBO Max, and I just keep on seeing it when I'm searching for horror movies, like the last 6 months or something. And so I had no context of it whatsoever. What, Max, I'm curious to hear, like, what was your reaction to the whole thing? Like, how did you feel after watching this thing? What emotions were you going through?
I was just at a loss for words, honestly. I'm not going to lie, man. I had drank like 1 or 2 drinks while watching this movie, and I thought to myself afterwards, like, was that too much? Like, was I just trash watching this movie and not understanding any of it?
Yeah. Did you enjoy it though? Did you like? I think for anybody who's going to watch it, can I say it's nonsensical?
It's got a certain dream logic to it, I would argue.
yeah, there's a dream logic, and there is, and I watched a couple like videos about this. So, like, there is an actual. I mean, the story that comes to mind here is the director asked his 10-year-old daughter what type of movie she would want to see, and like she has a conception credit here, concept by his daughter. On this film, like, and the ghost, the decapitated head biting into the girl's like rear end, that's her idea. Like, like all these ideas were like his daughter's, and that's the level that we're talking about here. I mean, this is like gonzo, not in the sense of the production necessarily, although it is, but just in the writing and the conceptualization. No one wanted to direct this film. They thought I forget what the production house was, but nobody involved wanted to touch this thing because of the script. Or like, if I film this, I will not have a career. And so eventually the guy wrote it, directs it, and it's like, it is hands down one of, if not the most bizarre films I've ever seen in my life. So to me, it's definitely in some sort of nonsensical realm. I don't know, Chris, am I being harsh?
No, I mean, I wouldn't call it nonsensical as a insult. But I also,
it's not an insult. It's definitely not an insult. Yeah.
But I also could watch Eraserhead on a loop for the rest of my life and be happy.
God, yeah.
So I love stories about film conceptions where it's just like it happens to be the right, like, insane ingredients. With Creepshow, it's very simple, just like 2 horror people, one from the literary world, one from the film world, and boom, you get magic. But in this case, like you mentioned, the production house was Toho in Tokyo, and this was right after like the worldwide success of Jaws, right?
Yeah.
And filmmakers and specifically production houses like Toho had been really trying in the 70s to make something that could be a worldwide hit. They see the beginnings of video gaming kind of being the nexus of how Tokyo becomes a global economy, but movies just like they're not sure how to make them at this point, right? But then they'd been basically making facsimiles of American B movies, both and everything from westerns to psychological thrillers to whatever. And so there was this exec at Toho that met with Obayashi, the director, who basically said, like, and he had heard this idea about the concept that his daughter had come up with, and at first the Toho producer was just like, okay, no, but can we think about something that would be more similar to Jaws? And Obayashi says, well, how much money have you guys been making on your ripoffs of American films? And the producer says, well, no, we haven't been successful. And so he literally tells him, okay, so you've been losing money on comprehensible films, so why don't we try something incomprehensible? and Toho is like, okay, sure, why not? Go do whatever you want to do. And so, like, not only does he have carte blanche as a filmmaker, but like they're actively trying to make something that's as far outside the mainstream as possible, and this is what you get.
I mean,
but the
yeah.
but the other fascinating thing, in my opinion, looking at it in longevity, like how does this eventually wind up stateside via Criterion in 2010? Like, it's one of those films that, before this mass access in the US became kind of like this, bootleg, I don't know, golden totem that budding filmmakers and art house people were passing along. Like everybody from like you can obliquely see like Tarantino's influences here, and a lot of modern, both Asian and American horror films, like
Evil Dead 2
yes,
we just watched Evil Dead 2 as part of this, and I was like, well, this feels like a 1-to-1.
Absolutely. Yeah, and Peter Jackson in New Zealand is also like, probably getting a big sense of this idea of a haunted house shouldn't be like the stereotypical like dry, walk through creepy rooms with creaking sounds and then jump scares. It should be like actually something that you would never expect when walking through a house, whether it's daytime or nighttime, or the gorgeous matte painting of sunsets that are in the film too. Like, that's the other thing. It's nonsensical, but it's like never
beautiful,
not pleasing to the eye. Like,
yeah, it's a gorgeous film. Like, there's so many different fascinating sequences that happen here. Now, do they make sense together? I don't think so. But like, it's like fireworks on screen. It is interesting. I think I appreciated this film much more than Evil Dead 2, because that was a first watch for me too, and I was just like, this to me feels a little bit like there's going off the rails, then there's House, and House is just like that much extra, where I was like, oh no, we're gonna just keep going. Like, the edge is here, we're just gonna sprint right off of it, not even think about it.
Yeah.
I don't know, Max, does this remind you of any other films that are out there, any of the films that you really like? Like, what did you like it, number one? Did you enjoy the nonsense and craziness of it?
That's the whole charm in this, honestly. This is a movie I can definitely show someone, I feel like, some of my film friends, and like, yep, you are not going to understand what happens. You're going to love it.
Yeah. No. Does it remind you of anything? Like, any other films that are out there now? Like, it seems so unique, right?
It reminds me a little bit of The Room, and maybe it's just because I heard of this movie the same time I heard of The Room.
Yeah.
But knowing how much of a disaster it was behind the scenes of that movie as well, how people didn't really want to touch it or work with Tommy, so he's like, I want to make my own movie.
Yeah.
A little bit of that, honestly.
Well, I guess diving deeper into that then, like, do you feel like The Room has such a fascinating life to it after it was made?
Yeah.
Like, its production obviously has its own thing. There's a movie about the production of it, Disaster Artist, which is a fun movie.
Yeah, I got to meet Greg Sestero a couple months ago, actually.
Oh, really? Interesting. Do you feel like the humor of The Room, like, in sort of the cult status that surrounded it, it felt like, are they laughing with Tommy? Right. Are they laughing at him? Like, what's that line there of like mocking or parody? Like, are they making fun of him, or are they having fun with him? You know what I mean? It's like a very distinct thing. And like with House, is it different types of like audience engagement? You know what I mean? Like, it's almost like House has this, I don't know, I was watching like some video and Bill Hader was like, this is the greatest movie ever. He was doing the Criterion thing.
Yes, I've seen that as well.
Yeah. So it's like, to him, it's like a House is this movie of respect. We should respect it. With The Room, it feels a little bit different. It feels like, oh, this is kind of crazy and interesting because it's so terrible, but then that kind of makes it awesome. I don't know. Do you feel like there's a distinction there between loving House and loving The Room?
I think it's kind of similar as well. With House, because specifically, you mentioned earlier the scene of the head that comes out of the well and bites the girl on her ear.
Yeah.
Looking at that scene, you can see the blue screen behind the head the whole time, like throughout this entire movie. Like, you can clearly see Some of the strings with the fingertips on the piano later on too.
Mm-hmm.
It's like we're seeing these very like off the wall. And you mentioned like a child basically partially wrote this film, or it's inspired by or conceptualized by her.
Yeah.
This feels exactly like that, and that's why I think the special effects we're seeing, it might be kind of crappy.
Yeah.
Even though we're looking for this, this is many years ago, obviously,
yeah,
and they're still kind of crappy, all things considered. But it's wild that we're seeing this on screen. I could not tell you what other movie is going to have a girl's chopped off fingertips playing piano after her body just got eaten by a piano, and then half of it is spun around, partially spit out, just for her to die further.
Yeah. It's truly a unique viewing experience.
Mm-hmm.
And as someone who's been watching movies for forever, and I don't shy away from more experimental stuff, but like this is almost a bridge too far for me to watch this thing. It was just like, I don't know I almost didn't get through it, to be honest with you. I was like, this is tough.
I had to take 2 days to watch this.
Yeah, it's tough. How do we think about House versus Creepshow in sort of like their approach to House? Is, I would say, it's comedic, right? It's supposed to be. It's supposed to be nonsensical, and it's a different type of humor than Creepshow. But they're both, I think, comedy at the end of the day. What is the overlap, Chris? Where do you think there's a connection here between the two?
I mean, this is a unique situation where it's the only episode of this self-aware horror series where we're getting in this international element, right?
Yeah.
And also, I mean, one thing that I think really does divide House from some of the other like midnight movie classics like The Room is that it's got this really deeply embedded commitment to like avant-garde and surrealism that is in some ways kind of loosely connected to the horror genre in the sense that horror films are often about the absurd, right?
Yeah.
Even if they are quote elevated or whatever art films, there is that like kind of very clear messaging throughout the DNA of horror movies, going all the way back to the B movies of the 50s, where it's like this is kind of silly, right? Like even the most serious horror movies have silliness to them. And I think that's ultimately the connective thread here, across the Pacific and 5 years apart. But then also, like we were kind of keep alluding to earlier in the show, you see that kind of getting to arguably to even further away from itself in the late 80s, early 90s. Whereas you go back to what we end up doing here on the last episode of this series is in Last House of the Left with Wes Craven and the advent of exploitation filmmaking. That it feels like there's that subversiveness that is like kind of fading away already in 77.
Yeah.
And yet like it took, almost 30 years for the film to get a wide release in the Western world. So I don't know.
It does feel subversive though, doesn't it?
It does.
I don't know, Max, when you saw it, did it feel kind of like that original question of Creepshow? Did it feel kind of taboo and unnerving?
A little bit.
I mean, it's tough now because I feel like we've seen everything with the internet and like every movie, and like you can see whatever you want in the world. But there was still something about this because of its own dream logic. It's sort of like a poetic logic that it has going on. That there was something about it that it is very unnerving, I felt. And, it's interesting, Chris, you bring up Last House on the Left because that, Wes Craven and Sean Cunningham said, hey, this is a reaction to Vietnam.
Yeah.
Well, House is a reaction to Hiroshima.
Right.
Yeah. Like there's this whole sort of, the director grew up in Hiroshima. All his friends died. The atomic bomb dropped that we dropped on them. And, and then obviously the subplot of the aunt having a husband who went to war and never came back. And that's why she's becomes what she is. There's a lot going on underneath the surface of House that you would never really pick up, but maybe explicitly because of the nonsensical nature of what's going on. But there's a lot of baggage to that film that was intentional, very intentional. It was not on accident. That, you know, he basically wrote it about how the purpose of House, and he says this explicitly, is that the young people do not understand what happened.
Yeah. This
will help them understand what happened. So it's essentially a World War II movie in a sense. They're trying to, in a very similar way that Last House on the Left tried to capture the horrors of the Vietnam War as it was happening. This is about someone who went through World War II and the horrors of that, trying to tell a younger generation, this is what it was like. It was, you know, not decapitated fingers, but cut off fingers playing the piano, or like getting eaten by, what does she get eaten by at the end? Like one of the girls that has like a pitcher with teeth on it.
Yeah.
Like what? I mean, it's just, do you feel like that level of political or artistic commentary is at all accessible in House?
No, but I mean that's perfect. The perfect indicator of like Criterion pulling it and then looking for those layers. And I mean, once you start uncovering them, and I mean, with it coming out in 2010 and the advent of, you know, Reddit and everything, kind of exploding film criticism and film analysis in a democratizing way, it makes sense. And then that's why like David Lynch ends up having a resurgence, and Twin Peaks comes back 20 years later and all that. So
yeah,
I think it's valid, but it's definitely inaccessible. But that's also part of the appeal, right? That's another part of like the subversiveness of horror.
You have to figure out the puzzle pieces to get the message at the end of the day. Oh wow, this is a good one. Max, would you recommend House to anybody that you know besides your friends that are really into film? Would you recommend it to just like a random person that you know you're friends with?
The people the people in the audience of the Batman.
Oh man, no, hell no. I would recommend this to any drug addict. Honestly.
Yeah, exactly. Right. What about Creepshow?
Creepshow, yeah. I mean, for kids my age, you know, if you grew up with Goosebumps, I think at least you can respect Creepshow if the story's not your cup of tea, because you know you're limited to 5 and compared to Goosebumps, which is I think 3 seasons worth.
Yeah.
You can at least respect where it came from. Yeah,
it's got there's enough on Creepshow, I think, to kind of entertain anybody and gross them out at the very least. What do you got coming up on Galaxy of Film? What's your next episode?
Currently, we're getting ready to work on an episode on A24's Euphoria, discussing seasons 1 and 2 of that.
Nice.
We're also pairing that with Spring Breakers, one of the earlier A24 films.
Really? You're doing Spring Breakers? Chris, have you seen Spring Breakers?
God damn it, Dan.
Yeah. Oh, you have? It's one of my favorite films, Max. I'm just going to throw that out there. I think it's a masterpiece.
Are you serious?
I do. I absolutely think it's a masterpiece.
Oh, boy.
I absolutely hate it.
Oh, there you go. We're going to end on a great conflicted note like we always do on Film Trace.
I have such weird feelings with it because I remember, you know, I was young when it came out. Keep in mind, I'm 22 now.
Yeah.
And you know, I grew up watching Selena Gomez as a kid.
Whoa.
So like,
it's going to be a little bit different for you. For us, it was like, whatever. I don't know who these people are.
Yeah. Going into that movie, dude, like I was expecting like, okay, Selena Gomez, she's about to be a badass.
When are you guys going to post the Euphoria? Pretty soon?
Yeah, we posted it tomorrow, actually. We uploaded it on Thursday.
So where can people find you? You guys are all in the normal places, right?
Yeah, we're on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, just everything at Galaxy of Film. We also post our bonus content, the LFG series as well, with our normal main show.
And then are you on Twitter?
We are on Twitter and Instagram at Galaxy of Film. And then YouTube hosts all of our vlog series whenever we get together and for certain events. We're getting ready to go to Star Wars Celebration in a couple months, so we'll have some content based on that on the YouTube channel.
Way cool, man. So definitely check it out. Thanks for joining us, Max.
Of course,
Chris, as always, it's been a pleasure. This has been Film Trace.